This is Outrageous History. Hello, I'm Ernest Granson, and welcome to Outrageous History. I'm pretty sure we've all heard Oscar Wilde's quote that there is only one thing in life worse than being talked about, and that is not being talked about. Of course, that comes from his only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, which was published in 1891. And if you're a follower of theater, you'll no doubt be familiar with one of his most famous plays, The Importance of Being Earnest. And so it's probably that image you know, that of a witty, condescending, and somewhat flamboyant dandy. But there really is so much more to the life of Oscar Wilde, a serious and in many ways a sad aspect. We're going to hear about the complex and somewhat puzzling life of Oscar Wilde from Heather Marcovitch, who teaches Victorian literature, children's literature, and literary theory at Red Deer College. Hello, Heather. Glad you could join us today.
Thank you, and glad to be here.
Now, Heather, you've published a number of books and articles about not only Oscar Wilde, but also Victorian literature and culture. The amount of material discussing and analyzing Wilde is really quite amazing. Wilde died more than 120 years ago, and his career is relatively short. Why do you think there's still so much interest in this individual?
Oh, I think, honestly, I think there's two reasons for Oscar Wilde's continuing popularity. One is his biography. He's one of the rare writers that his life is as interesting as anything he's written. It's as dramatic, it's as full of elements that people love to interpret. It also has a lot of staying power. I mean, it's the interpretations of his life has changed in the 120 plus years since he died. Here's a man who he went to jail for being gay. In a system in England where that law wasn't repealed until 1987. So this is, he was very much sort of this poster boy for gay life and also for especially gay martyrdom, the fact that you could very much suffer from a society's legalized homophobia. On the other hand, his writings still endure because I think people still find them so contemporary. He's one of those writers that even though, he wrote when there was a different century, and so much of our culture is different from where it was, but his insights on society, his insights on social hypocrisy, his insights on what people need to get society going and what they lack is still so very timely. He wrote in a time when there was a celebrity culture and a very quick celebrity culture happening that's very similar to ours. They had regular media, not social media, but he was very much a critic of this kind of shallow fame. But what I think really endears him to people is that he's not one of those writers who will pound a book or get on a pulpit and preach to people about how terrible they're being. He did it through wit. He did it through humor. He famously had the people he was making fun of laugh the hardest sometimes at some of his lines and some of his plays.
Well, now he was quite young when he came into that public focus. As a matter of fact, from the material that I read, he didn't really have a large body of work behind him, or if any, really, when he took his famous tour to the United States. And yet, by the time he arrived, he had become an overwhelming celebrity. What happened there? And was he in control of a lot of that type of celebrity that almost like today's social platforms?
More than sometimes people will give him credit for. He became famous when he was still a university student at Oxford. And in order to sort of figure out how that could actually happen, that someone who just was a college student who basically at most was known in the college, in the Oxford College community, how he could actually get a measure of fame that would bring him all the way to London. This is a time period where Oxford University students could make the popular press in London. They could have stories written about them because they did or said something really smart or really outrageous. Wilde, I think, first came to the mainstream press's attention when he won a major award for one of his poems. He also came to their attention when he took what was called a double first in Oxford, which just meant he had sort of the highest honors that one could have, and that also got published. This is a time period where no details seem too mundane or too small to merit someone writing a story about it. And he distinguished himself at Oxford because he very much sort of created his image as a dandy, even way back when. He pretended that he never did any work, although we know that's not true at all. He pretended he was too busy dealing with beautiful things and dealing with art, although we know he could also wrestle, and he could also, run a, row, kind of a mean race on the river. And he would say, really outlandish things. Like one of his famous quotes was, I hope one day to live up to my blue china, which is completely nonsensical, and he knew it was completely nonsensical, but it did make the papers. I think he knew from a fairly young age, in his 20s, that that it didn't really matter what you said as long as it sounded clever, and then someone would publish it somewhere. So by the time he goes to London, and he's about 25, 26 years old at that point, he had graduated, he's going down to London, he's going to try to make it as a writer. And all he really has under his belt are these sort of one-liners and these sort of quips that the press would pick up, and they would do it fairly derisively to say, "Oh, look at kids today. Look at what Oxford's producing. These sort of kids who just all they talk about is blue china, and they're certainly not going to amount to anything." But he caught the attention of D'Oyly Carte, who was an impresario. And he was in the middle of putting on Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta Patience onto an American tour. And Patience, I think luckily for Wilde, had a major character in it who is supposed to be, again, this parody of the aesthetic movement. These men who dress really fashionably and who seemingly talk really flakily about art. And even though there's absolutely no way Wilde could have been a model for it, he seemed to have just fit the bill so much. So D'Oyly Carte gets in touch with them and says, "Would you be interested in lecturing on aesthetic matters, and in conjunction with the places that are going to be getting Gilbert and Sullivan's Patience?" And it would be this nice little synergy. And Wilde, who was broke, who didn't really have a steady job, said, "Sure, why not?" And he really was canny at just milking that for as much as he could. He had a series of photographs taken of him, and these are some of the most famous photographs of Wilde. If you ever see Wilde with long hair and a big velvet smoking jacket, this is where he went. He went to the same photographer who photographed the famous actress Sarah Bernhardt for publicity stills. And it was actually really common at that time period for celebrities, both major and minor, to have pictures taken of themselves and sometimes have them sold or even traded, like, you would trade baseball cards, I suppose, without the bubble gum. And by the time he had his pictures taken in his fancy aesthetic dress, and advance notice by D'Oyly Carte was given to the American reporters that, the real life aesthete from Gilbert and Sullivan's Patience was coming to lecture on decoration, on interior decor, basically. That was the subject of his talks. By the time he crosses the Atlantic on the ship, he's being met with a throng of reporters. They know he's coming. He's gotten some advance copy. They even have some pictures of him. So he basically knows how to take advantage of the situation. He gets off in New York, and the first thing the reporters asked him was, did you say if you had anything to declare? And he said, nothing but my genius. And
that's where it comes from.
That's become a famous Oscar Wilde quote. So that's what he did. And so he basically followed in many ways Gilbert and Sullivan's operetta. And he also, though, he added to it as well. He had letters of introduction to some of the leading poets and writers in America. So reports and stories in the newspapers were being said that, he was hanging out with Walt Whitman, for instance. That he had, he had corresponded with Julia Ward Howe, who wrote the Battle Hymn of the Republic. He was lecturing not just formally at night, but he was also giving informal lectures to university students in America, the ones he knew best, who would come and support Oscar Wilde in his talks by dressing up like him. And he was really, really great at that. He sold his likeness to a bunch of different companies for ads. So you can see Wilde at the same pose in an aesthetic dress, who was selling cigars, he's selling ice cream, just pretty much, anything that got his sort of picture in the press, and was always careful. Like, he knew sort of what to do to get himself noticed. When he was out in Colorado, he had actually given a talk to a group of miners in Colorado about aesthetics, and apparently endeared himself so much to them, they named a drill bit after him.
Oh my gosh.
Which he took as a great compliment. He was quite touched that they would do that.
But now he was somewhat successful, from what I understand, that tour. But his promoter tried to take advantage of him in some way. I think Wilde realized that after Wilde.
Yeah, there's always a push-pull, and Wilde was not the only one that always had the struggle with, producers, with promoters, with publishers. The fact that, they knew that they were, in a sense, beholden to them for jobs, for money, for livelihood. But Wilde was really clever at getting his own name out. Today we'd call it a brand, but he was branding himself at a very early age. They probably would have been horrified at that idea back then. But he was really with that, because he knew that despite D'Oyly Clark's attempt to rein him in, or to have him do what he wants him to do, he knew the fact that D'Oyly Clark's name is not making the papers. Oscar Wilde's name is. And the fact that he also was looking at a career beyond just being the representative of a Gilbert and Sullivan play.
And so, what happened then when he returned to Britain? He, at that point, he was lecturing, but really still didn't have a lot of successful works in as far as literature went.
Yeah, it took about 7 or 8 years between the last lecturing tour, because he went twice over to the United States and to parts of Canada as well. It took about 7 or 8 years. He came back. Britain historically was not that impressed about what you did when you were over in the colonies, which they still thought of them as colonies, even though a war had been fought a century prior. They weren't that impressed. If you were a star in the United States, very often, they basically said, well, what have you done for us? So he spent 7 or 8 years as a working journalist, as trying really hard to just write anything. Most of his work was unsigned. He wrote a few poems here and there. He stayed in the news by becoming sort of this friend and advisor to famous women. And the most notable ones was Sarah Bernhardt, the great French actress who was starting to make her first appearances on the London stage. And he basically was her unofficial promoter in the press. He would write these beautiful essays on how the divine Sarah was coming over, and he would always be seen with her. It was very smart. He would publicize both of them at the same time. The other one was Lily Langtry, who was she was a woman who was first became famous when she got painted by John Millais, the great Victorian painter, and she ended up her big claim to fame, despite dabbling here, dabbling there, was being one of the mistresses of the Prince of Wales.
Oh yes,
yeah,
that name pops up.
So he advised her how to dress, he advised her how to comport herself, and it was really funny that he was doing it because Wilde was no more high society than your average Britainer. He was middle class. He was from Ireland, which made him somewhat inferior to the dyed-in-the-wool British society. And it didn't bother him a bit. He styled her hair. He told her how to dress. He brought her out there. He wrote about her. He helped to publicize her. So this is sort of what he was doing. When he came back from the tour, he had written a couple of plays that did not really go anywhere. They weren't comedies, interesting. One was a play about anarchism. Anarchists were sort of the terrorists of the 1880s in London, and there was a lot of tension and worry about the anarchist movement, even though, many anarchists were very peaceful people. So he wrote a play about anarchism, and he wrote a play that was this really sort of long play and poetry, basically. Neither of them really were successful. They only ran for short periods of time. The thing that changed it actually was when he took the editorship of a women's magazine. And that's what started to really put him on the map. He got an offer to edit what was then called The Ladies' World, which was a fashion magazine for women. Fashion tips, beauty tips, some etiquette tips, how to host a dinner party, things like that. And Wilde said he would take it on. He needed the money again. He had just married. He was the father of 2 young boys. And he decided he was going to change the whole thing. So he changed the name. He said, this is about women, not about ladies. We're going to call it The Women's World. He decided that fashion and beauty and etiquette was not worthy of the women who were going to read his magazine. So he commissioned a bunch of women writers, actresses, early activists for women's rights, figures in society, to write about politics, to write about economics, to write about theater in a serious way, to write about history. It was rather incredible for that time. It was a magazine that even today would be notable for its, what we would call sort of this feminist angle.
Yeah, so it was quite insightful in that way. But then didn't his personal life then start to get complicated?
Yes, it did. He was, like I said, he was married. He married a young woman, Constance. They had 2 sons. Not much is known about whether or not he had whether or not he had felt himself to be gay before he had his first affair with the man. It's rumored to have been his friend Robert Ross. And that and that is when he basically, again, sort of for the time period, sort of recognized that he was gay, that he was homosexual. There's not much known about it beforehand. He was engaged before he married Constance, ironically, to the woman who would later marry Bram Stoker of Dracula fame.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I think Bram Stoker didn't really like Oscar Wilde all that much. But yeah, he started to lead this sort of classic double life that if you were a gay man in Victorian England, most of the time that is what you had to do. It not all the time, but in Wilde's case, it was sort of this classic sort of situation where he had the wife and the two children at home, and he would leave for evenings. He would leave for several days at a time, and he would hang out with his other gay friends in a sort of de facto gay underground.
And it turned into a bit of a dangerous situation.
Yeah, it turned into a bit of a dangerous situation. It was a place that was populated not just by sort of the sons of aristocrats and by sort of middle-class artists and men, but also by male prostitutes and male hustlers, and quite a few of them too. And Wilde was sort of hobnobbed with a bunch of them. It got really kind of worrying when in a couple of years before, actually a year or so before he wrote the picture of Dorian Gray, there was a big sort of discovery that one of Victoria's sons and his friends were seen as sort of frequenting this place that was known as a male brothel. And it was called the Cleveland Street Scandal because that's where the brothel was. And it's, it sort of caused a huge homophobic outcry in the press. And, a lot of gay men at the time were they decided they needed to kind of distance themselves and sort of keep quiet. But Wilde had a series of affairs with men before he met Alfred Douglas, who is best known as being his sort of long-term lover throughout the 1890s. And interestingly, a lot of the men that he had affairs with were writers and were artists themselves. So there was that world that he was sort of hobnobbing in.
His ultimate demise, interestingly and maybe contradictorily, came when he initiated a lawsuit of slander against the father of his longtime companion.
Yeah, what happened was that he was sort of egged on to it by Bosie Douglas. Bosie Douglas and his father, they hated each other. It was made worse when his older brother, who was acting as an aide to an aristocrat in Egypt, killed himself. And he killed himself widely because it was thought that his homosexuality was about to be basically outed and revealed. His father sort of knew. His father, had absolutely, nothing to say to his sons if they were going to be, having affairs with men. He was a tough guy, very much. He was an active, absolutely, he was not having sissies for boys was really his point of view. And Bosie Douglas never forgave his father for basically, what he thought was just sort of, just fomenting his older brother's suicide. And when his father started to harass Wilde for, basically spending so much time with his son, he would send him really kind of nasty calling cards. The straw that broke the camel's back was in the opening of The Importance of Being Earnest, when he put out a calling card that said, with the famous misspelling to Oscar Wilde, posing as a somdomite. And Bosie Douglas basically said, you have to sue my father for libel. He cannot get away with this. And he really was the one who just really sort of egged Wilde on to sue him for libel, against a lot of his friends' better judgment, because they knew that if you sued for libel, you were the one who had to prove that what the Marquis of Queensberry, Douglas's father, was saying was untrue. And his friend said, you can't do that, because what he said was obnoxious, it was harassing, but it wasn't untrue. People have tried to interpret what posing as a somdomite rather than being one means, but I think for the ears of the British courts, I don't think they were ready to sort of parse out such fine distinctions in the calling card. So, he did. He sued him for libel, and basically what happens was that what was really strange about the trial was that when the opposing counsel, who was actually Oscar Wilde's old classmate from Oxford, when the opposing counsel decided that they were going to basically put Oscar Wilde on the stand, they actually used the picture of Dorian Gray as evidence.
Mm-hmm.
So he would read whole passages from the picture of Dorian Gray and saying, can you truly say that a man who would write such things would be innocent of what you were accused of by the Marquis? And Wilde was brilliant during that period. He was responding. He basically was saying in a very witty tone that you, sir, are an idiot for even making this connection. I am an artist. I wrote a novel. I wrote a work of art. This has no bearing on my personal life. And even if it did, the only thing I wrote in my book was the nobility and beauty of two people who share a bond that is as great as David and Jonathan's in the Bible. And it made the opposing counsel very nervous. At some point, he was getting such a response from the audience in the courtroom that the judge was threatening to clear it out. What turned the tide against Oscar Wilde was that they were bringing in witnesses, mostly male prostitutes, both professional and semi-professional. There's a consensus by people reading this after the fact that the father-in-law Queensberry probably bought these witnesses off, gave them a certain amount of money and clothes for them to tell them not just that they knew Oscar Wilde, but what Oscar Wilde did that was so heinous. That the likely consensus with that, at the very least, some of these were huge exaggerations. Some of these might have been outright fabrications, or only half-truths. And but that did turn the tide when you had all these sort of these poor boys coming in saying how Oscar Wilde, I spent the night with Oscar Wilde, he promised me a lovely dinner, he gave me a silver cigarette case, etc., etc. One of the other things was that Wilde was being blackmailed. At a couple of points in time, there were people who knew about his relationship with Alfred Douglas and wanted to extort some money out of him. Wilde again said, well, you should publish these letters that you have of mine to Alfred Douglas because they are so well written. And I would be proud to see them in print. Mm-hmm. So what happened was sufficient enough in the first trial for Wilde to lose the libel case, because he couldn't have proved beyond a doubt that what was being accused did not happen. And because he lost, the Crown turned around and charged him with criminal charges. And so back to court he went, but this time as the defendant, not as a plaintiff, this time in the dock, this time, with a lot more emphasis being put on these sexual encounters that he had with men. And it also became, in the eyes of the Victorian public, one of the big crimes that he might have committed was he crossed class lines.
Mm-hmm. Which is just as big a scandal, I suppose.
It was. It was one thing to keep company with a male aristocrat. It was sort of one of those things that I think some people said, well, these things happen with the decadent rich. But the fact that he went and he went to working class boys, he went to poor boys, he went to boys who were male prostitutes, that added this note of unsavoriness to the whole proceedings. The second trial, although did not convict him, the second trial ended in a hung jury. And he was given a week before that case would be retried, a week in which virtually everyone begged him to get out of the country. There was an idea that they gave a week's stay between the trials so that he would have time to get on a boat and go to France. And because once he was out of England, they weren't going to bother him anymore. His friends said, please leave the country. We will help you. The only one who really didn't was his mother, who believed he should stay and fight for what he believed in. End of the story is he didn't go. he got tried a third time, and that was when he was convicted of gross indecency.
And sentenced to prison, and which eventually really had a serious effect on his health and his eventual death. Yes.
Yeah, it killed him. He suffered a terrible fall in prison, developed meningitis as a result of that fall. He died a few years later, 3 years later to be precise, but it was widely considered that it was that fall and the resulting infection that took place that ended up killing him. And he was only 46 at the time. He was very young.
You have to wonder what other types of works he would have been able to compose if all of that trouble hadn't followed him around.
Yeah, you do. I mean, the one thing that came out after his prison sentence, The Ballad of Red Angel, is a stunning poem.
Mm-hmm.
It's absolutely beautiful. He was working on things before he died. It was hard for him because he had no money. He gave everything to the lawyers, and everything else went to his wife, who divorced him and was now raising his two sons under a different name. And a lot of his effort, unfortunately, after he got out of jail, was writing letters to friends begging them for money. Especially since, it was also true that he would go to hotels in Paris and in other parts of France, and they would ask him to leave after a while because the other patrons would complain that this notorious man was in the same hotel as them. So he had to sort of flit from hotel to hotel. He went down to Algeria for a while. He went back up to France, mostly in the Paris area. And, I always thought what would happen if he had not had so much of his effort spent having to write letters to friends, and real reluctant letters. You could tell that this was really hurting him to do that.
So he left somewhat of a legacy. I mean, he was obscure after his death for a certain number of years, but now that has changed. I can't tell you how many books there are out there about him. But so his legacy has become much more positive, I think, over the years.
Yeah, I think his legacy's had a bit of a change too. His plays started to get performed actually not that long after his death. Give it about 5 years or so, we see a performance of The Importance of Being Earnest. What starts to really help is that Robert Ross, his friend, the first man he had an affair with, was also his literary executor and put out the complete works of Oscar Wilde in the early 1900s, which sort of, in a very, kind of time had passed. The trial was now over a decade in the past. Wilde had died. There was now a bit of a softening towards reading Oscar Wilde again. But what is really interesting is that up until the 1970s or so, whereas people were really interested in Oscar Wilde, there was very little, if any, mention made of his homosexuality.
Mm-hmm.
There's these great things where people are doing plays about Oscar Wilde and movies about Oscar Wilde, including the big scandal that gets publicized, but there's no mention of what the scandal is. Alfred Douglas is mentioned as a particular friend, and they leave it at that. I think it's really only in the 1970s, after the Stonewall riots, when the gay rights and the gay liberation movement start getting into full swing, that Oscar Wilde gets reclaimed as a gay artist, and as an artist up with all the other gay artists in literary history. And I think that really helps. And so now, 50 years on from that period, it would probably be inconceivable to read anything about Oscar Wilde that doesn't mention his life, that doesn't mention his sexuality, that doesn't look for it in what he's writing, even if Wilde would have wanted it there or not.
Yeah, so he is still considered, as far as his literary standing, he's still considered somebody that has really contributed, and then he has also contributed in normal society, or what has become more of a normal society.
Well, I think one thing with Oscar Wilde is that his books are still read. The Picture of Dorian Gray is still a very popular book. The Importance of Being Earnest gets performed pretty much everywhere in several different languages. On a fairly regular basis, his other plays, his other comedies especially, get performed and they get read. His fairy tales are widely anthologized in children's literature books. He's a major literary figure, and I think one of the reasons for his enduring appeal is that he speaks to us as much as he spoke to his time period. I think part of it is that our time period is very much like the 1890s. The differences, there's different technology, absolutely, but our interest in celebrity culture, are interested in, of course, in sort of celebrities of the minute, are interested in people who are celebrities. We're not quite sure what they've done, but they seem to be everywhere. The kind of obsession people sometimes have with superficialities, with how you look, and, if you look young, if you look old, if you're conventionally attractive. Wilde saw this in his time period, and he saw this as a problem, basically. And it's something that I think a lot of people, when they read today, recognize this. They're saying, "Oh, look, he's talking about this influencer that I'm annoyed by, or he's talking about these weird, that he's talking about this plastic surgery craze. He's just using sort of a different metaphors for it."
And that really speaks to his relevancy, I think.
Yeah.
So Heather, we're running out of time, but I sure appreciate you taking time out to talk to us about this really, really intriguing figure in the past and who has become relevant. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
And thanks to all of you for tuning in. I'm Ernest Granson. This is Outrageous History, and we'll see you again soon. Outrageous History is produced by Northern Flicker Media.